Well, good evening, everyone. I'm Steve Henegar, and along with my friends Kriya Kaping and Mike Devenney, we'd like to welcome you to the Portland Storytellers Guild's October performance of Catalyst. And we'll talk about those change agents in just a minute, but also I'd like to welcome you here to Artichoke, a music store, music instruction, and actually, yes, the performance venue. Not only of the Guild, but any number of groups and individuals across Portland. So there's always something going on here. So in light of that, we'd like to thank all the wonderful volunteers here at Artichoke for everything they do to make these events possible. So thank you, friends. So, a catalyst. A change agent that alters a reaction without necessarily changing itself. But you know as well as I that change is the ocean we swim in, right? So it's almost impossible to point and say, that's how it started. Fortunately, stories let us step out of the flood so that we can look more closely at that, all that experience rushing by us, so that even in our everyday life, our aspirations, even in our history, we can finally point and say, that's how I got here. I had intended so many other things, or I was so sure and young. Or I didn't see that coming, but I knew I had to get involved. But how did that start? What was the change agent? What was that unexpected catalyst that altered our direction, our expectations, our understanding? This evening, we're going to tell you about some of those points of change. So I hope you'll help me in welcoming our first performer this evening, Mike Devenney. Mike, it's all yours.
Good evening. Well, Stephen's already talked to you about the difficulty of finding just that moment when a catalyst happens, but it wasn't so hard for me. I found it when I was 7 years old, in my house. My older brother and I were sleeping upstairs in our bedroom, and our mother came rushing into this room and went right to Mark and said, "Mark, wake up. Honey, wake up. I really need to talk to you." And Mark opened his eyes, and Mom goes, "Look, your father's really ill. I've called the ambulance, and I'm going to go to the hospital with him, so I'm going to need you to take care of the kids." And then she left just as quick. Well, Mark got up right away and changed, and he was heading out of the bedroom, and he saw me, and he goes, "Well, Mike, why don't you just go back to sleep?" Yeah, right. I think I'll just go back to sleep. As soon as he left, I got out, and I got some clothes on, and I headed down the stairs. And as I was going down the stairs, in the hallway, I could see my family. There was my mom, and then my two older sisters, Donna and Mimi. And beyond them was my brother Mark. The door was wide open, but he was turned this way with the screen door, keeping it open. And the moon was shining on his face and on his chest. And I looked at him and I went, he looks just like a guardian angel. He's here to protect us. Well, this was 1960. And 911 wasn't a thing yet in our little town. So if you had an emergency, you had to depend on the volunteer rescue squad. And there they were, right away. I went to the door to look out, and I watched, and two men went to the back of the ambulance, and they opened up the doors, and they pulled out this black and silver thing. And I had no idea what it was, and my sister said, "Oh, let's watch what happens." And they flipped it open, and it was this great big bed. They'll use that to bring Dad out. So it was and she called it a gurney, and it went by us and then stopped. And I looked back outside again, and there was another man. He was a giant of a man. He had to be 6.5 feet tall. Nothing but muscle. And when he got to the doorstop, he blocked the light of the moon, and it bounced off his shoulders and his head, and he sparkled. And I thought, wow, this guy's electric. When he stepped into the house, I knew by the way he talked and the way he walked, but he was the captain of this crew. And he had this black satchel, just like the ones you'd see for doctors on TV shows. And he was the guy holding that, so I knew he must be the boss. Well, he talked to Mom for just a little bit, and then they went into to get my dad, and they closed the door behind him. It wasn't just a couple of minutes, just before it was opened again, and they were wheeling my dad out, and as he went by me, I called out, "Dad!" But he didn't respond. So when it finally got outside, everybody followed that gurney down to the ambulance, except for me. I was still standing in the hallway, frozen, scared. I couldn't move, and I don't even remember breathing. And then I looked, and the captain came out of the bedroom, and he saw me there. And instead of just walking by me, he walked over to me, and he put his bag down, and then he went down on one knee, and he put his hand on my shoulder, and he said to me, "Your dad is going to be okay." Now, I've told that story throughout the years to several people, and a lot of them get really upset with that, saying that he had no right of making a diagnosis. He wasn't a doctor. And I just kind of felt like you weren't there. You weren't that 7-year-old boy trying to hold back the tears by gritting my teeth. You weren't that boy that thought the whole world that he knew was falling apart. That man talked from his heart, and what he said went to my heart. And I knew that it was true. And when I think back on that guy, I always remember what he wore. It was a blue and gray short-sleeved shirt, and it had a patch right here. It was a red cross on a field of white and a circle of words that said, American Red Cross. And that's the moment. That was my catalyst. It was at that moment that I chose to walk a path of the Red Cross being my companion. And it's still true today. When I was, I guess maybe 10, the Red Cross taught me how to swim. When I was 15, the Red Cross taught me how to be a lifeguard. When I was 16, I organized a Red Cross blood donorship to come in to our high school. From that point on, I've been a blood donor for over 50 years. When I retired, I switched over and became a platelets donor. And if you think I'm exaggerating, I'll show you what I mean. You get a shirt every time. When I went to college, I was studying to be a health teacher. And I took every Red Cross class that they had, all the way from, started off with babysitting and then get into the Heimlich maneuver and CPR, and all that kind of stuff. I even took pet first aid. And I don't even have a pet. But if you have a parakeet that goes into cardiac arrest, I'm your guy. Well, I worked with the Red Cross for so long, I have all sorts of stories. But my favorite stories come from my students. I used the Red Cross curriculum in my health class every single semester for 28 years. I have well over 1,000 students who were certified in first aid and CPR, along with about 200 faculty members. Well, on this one particular day, I was doing lunch duty. In fact, it was at the end of the spring, and I was only 5 days away from retiring. So I was standing there in the hallway just outside the cafeteria, making sure that nobody was going to go out and go somewhere they weren't supposed to go. And a couple of friends of mine, a couple of teachers came up, and they started joking with me about how I was going to miss doing lunch duty. And while we were laughing about it, the cafeteria exploded with sound. And what we were hearing was, "Martha, Martha, Martha." We thought it was a fight. So we rushed inside, but no, it wasn't a fight. It was a rescue. I could see a group of kids kind of packed in towards the back of the cafeteria, and I went straight forward and I cleared some kids away, and one of the boys goes, "Oh, Mr. D, you should have been here. This was great." I said, "Well, what happened?" He goes, "Well, Janet was choking, and Martha just jumped out of her chair, came around, pulled her up, stood her up, and started giving her Heimlich maneuver. And this big chunk of chicken flew right out of her mouth and onto the floor. And one of the other boys was, "Oh, well, here it is." he goes, "Look, there's a bone in it." And I said, "Let's settle down, guys." And I took Janet, and I got her to sit down again, and just to see if she was okay. And I thought it would be a good idea just to take her into a quieter place for a while. So I walked her out and got another teacher to go with me, and we just sat down with her, and she was fine. Well, the chanting happened when Janet started to breathe again. And every student in there cheered, like a teenager would, for Martha. "Martha, Martha, Martha." It was awesome. Well, that afternoon, just at the end of school that day, Martha came into my classroom. She goes, "Mr. Devenney, I was scared when I was doing that Heimlich maneuver. And I've been shaking all afternoon. Is that normal?" I went, "Yeah, Martha, that's normal. But you're not shaking out of fear. You're shaking out of awe. You just saved somebody's life. You were the right person at the right time with the right skills to make a positive difference in somebody's life. You didn't just change Janet's life by saving her, you saved the life of her family. Imagine if there was no one there and she died the week before graduation. Or imagine the look on all the kids in this cafeteria and how scared that they would be forever. But you turned what could have been a tragedy into a story that's going to be told hundreds of times. A giant of a man wearing a patch laid out for me a pathway where my companion was the Red Cross. And I thank him. Thank you. I can do show and tell at the end of it.
Thanks, Mike.
I forgot.
Yes?
He's going up there.
Oh, yes. So, like many of you, I suspect, my first experience with storytelling was listening to people in my family tell stories about other people in the family, right? You know how that works. And one thing I learned listening to my dad's side of the family was that all the men in the Henegar family have plans. No matter the issue, no matter the challenge, we have plans. Some of them more thought out than others. At one time, my Uncle Bill was telling me and some of the other uncles about my great uncle Jim. And Bill was saying, Jim, he was a man with a plan. And when World War I came along, he understood his duty and he felt it, and he joined up and he went off to fight the Kaiser. Now, Jim's brother, Kriya, was too young to enlist, so he spent the war working behind a drugstore counter there in Lubbock, Texas, selling sodas and sundries and whatnot. But under the counter, he sold condoms, which were illegal right then, but that was his plan to develop a little pocket change, and he looked on it as his contribution to the war effort. Now, in 1918, when the war was over, Jim came back from all the mud and the trenches in Europe, and people that had known him said that he just looked thinner than before he'd gone out into the world. In fact, one of the aunts muttered, said, "Oh, you could just almost see right through him." But when Jim got back to the U.S., he told his sergeant that he thought he'd head home because family needed help on the farm. Sergeant told me, he said, "Son, that's just not how this works. So you finish up your enlistment, then you go home. Jesus, boy, you survived the trenches. What more do you want?" But Jim persisted, said, "Wasn't the war over?" The sergeant had to admit, well, yes, the war was over. And later that evening, then, Jim left early. Went home to work on the family farm. Of course, when he got there, the family said, "You cannot just leave early. Why, if they don't lock you up for the rest of your natural-born life, they'll just shoot you." Which spooked Jim, and he laid low. Now, Bill was saying, you know, government probably had lots of other things to worry about right then than just one lone Texas farm boy who'd served well and honorably, but just left early. Still, on Saturdays, when the family would go into town to visit and shop, Jim, he stayed out at the farm, and then at dusk, he would walk into town, figuring, I guess, that everybody he'd grown up with would be less likely to recognize him then. And there was something about not being noticed that made him feel just more comfortable in his skin, although he couldn't quite put his finger on why that was. Now, a number of months later, Jim, he was out in the fields. He could see all the way to the horizon. And what he could see was a big storm rushing at him over the plains, and the thunder coming in ahead of that storm while it rolled over him like the artillery barrages still in his dreams. And he shivered. And he knew that although the government hadn't caught him yet, he became more and more convinced that it was hiding out in ambush just out of sight. But by that time, Jim had a plan for his escape. And the first part of the plan involved sitting down with his brother Kriya and pointing out that rubbers were still illegal. And what with your contribution to the war effort there at the drugstore, government probably has their eye on you as well. Which spooked Kriya because he was always the quieter and the shyer of the two boys. Now, the first part of that plan after Kriya was he'd sit down with his mom and made sure that she would pack them each a big sack lunch so they'd have something to eat during the escape. Now, faced with the apparent inevitability of his escape, regardless of what he had to say about it, Kriya went into his room and he began to rummage under his bed where he stored things, and he filled all of his pockets with condoms. Meaning to sell them for traveling money as they went along, because that was his plan, and he was sticking to it. Okay. Now, third part of the plan involved their dad hitching up the wagon right there at dusk, and the boys dove in the back of the wagon, scooched up underneath a pile of gunny sacks so it looked like just a big pile of vegetables back there. And Pap, he drove that wagon out and around the fields and onto the road out of town. And along about midnight, Pap turned that wagon around, headed back home, boys jumped out, and Jim led Cridy out into the world. And they walked all that night, good part of the next morning, and by that time, they were really hungry, because as you imagine, they'd eaten those sack lunches as soon as they hit the ground walking. Now, about noon, though, Jim looked over at his right down a little dip in the land, and he could see a big, prosperous-looking farmhouse, threshers in the field beyond, women coming and going around the house, bringing out trestle tables, getting ready for the noon meal. He said, "That's where we'll have dinner." Now, Cridy, who you remember was the quieter and the shyer of the two boys, reached into his pocket for a handful of condoms and pointed out that there's a little small town just up the road, and they could sell enough rubbers and buy their own dinner. And Jim looked at him and considered that. Finally, he said, "No. I mean, it's just too dangerous. You can't just walk into town and buy your dinner." Cridy looked over at his brother with some concern and said, "Well, usually you could." But by that time, Jim had his plan for dinner. He slapped around on his jeans till he came up with a little scrap of paper and a stub of a pencil. And he wrote out a note that said that he was a deaf mute and he was going home to see his dying mother. And could they help him? And before Cridy could stop him, Jim stepped off the road, headed down that little dip in the land, in among the women who greeted him first with smiles of welcome and then looks of concern and sympathy, until finally one of them took him over to a trestle table, had him sit down, brought him a big plate of food, and when Jim had that food in front of him, he leaned back and he pointed up to where Cridy had been hiding out in some bushes up by the road. And with a growing sense of consternation, Cridy saw this woman start up toward him. As she got closer, he could tell she's a big, strong woman, probably the lady of the house, had a big plate of food, tears streaming down her face. And she walked up, handed him that food, said, "You poor boy, are you a deaf mute too?" And Cridy, he was so upset, he couldn't think what to say except, "Yes, ma'am." Okay, so needless to say, the boys left there full, but rather quickly, before the field hands got in there for the noon meal. Didn't even stop at that next small town, although by the time they walked from one side to the other, Cridy had sold enough condoms so they had traveling money for the next 2 or 3 days. Over the next 3 or 4 months, they worked their way through that part of the country, doing odd jobs here and there, rain or shine. And Cridy began to notice that as Jim slogged through the mud after those rains, she just got more and more edgy, which he hadn't been like before. I mean, they'd grown up on a farm. There was always mud. It wasn't your friend, but, it was familiar. Unless, Cridy wondered, it was the mud that come in on the end of the rain, and then, of course, the thunder, which probably the ghost of the big guns that Jim always muttered about in his sleep. Still, they didn't stay any one place more than 2 or 3 days, and if they did stay more, Jim got more and more edgy and more convinced that while the government hadn't caught up with him just yet, they must be just 2 steps behind, and he became more and more convinced that perhaps the civilian world wasn't as safe as he had hoped. And so they joined the Army and went on to serve well and honorably for a while. But one evening around the barracks, Jim was looking in the mirror, and he come face to face with the fact that although the government had still not caught up, he knew they must be behind him, waiting in ambush, and a growing sense of unease rode in on the wings of just this ordinary thunderstorm, and he became more and more convinced that perhaps they had given away too much by joining the Army, and so they left early, went home to work on the family farm. Bill was telling me and the uncles, he said, Jim, he was always a man with a plan. And he was always, though, a man looking over his shoulder. And years later, when he finally died, they found him in a small upstairs corner room of this old run-down boarding house, and his entire worldly goods right there in his suitcase was a clean white shirt and a bottle of gin. And the uncles looked at each other and leaned back in their chairs to think about that. And then finally, Buddy, who was the youngest of the boys, though not the shyest, leaned forward with a tight little smile, said, well, at least he didn't die a poor man. And Kriya changed his name to Jack. And he eventually left the farm, went on to start his own family, and slowly worked his way up over the years until he was the head of Water and Sewer Department in Roswell, New Mexico. And we used to go visit him there as kids on vacation, and to get out of the hot afternoon heat, we would all crowd into this dim front room of that small little house that they had, and then listen to more Henegar men tell even more stories about Jim and Kriya, and then admit that even some of their own plans and best intentions had gone awry. And after the stories, Jack would reach into his pocket for some change, and he would share it out to all of us kids quarter at a time so that we could walk up to a nearby drugstore and buy a soda from yet another cousin behind the counter. But what fascinated us was that whenever Jack walked across the room, he just absolutely jangled with pocket change. And we asked him about that one time, and he was quiet for almost a minute. And finally he said, well, I guess it's just habit, but left over from an earlier plan. That's right. Thank you. So we're going to close out the first half here by welcoming back Mike Devenney. Mike.
The poet M.A. Hershey once said, courage doesn't always roar. Sometimes courage is a soft voice at the end of the day that says, I will try again tomorrow. That was the definition of Peter. He was a student of mine at LaSalle Catholic, right out in Milwaukee. And he was amazing. The school itself has a school within it for children, students who have learning issues. For Peter, he didn't really have a whole lot of control emotionally. It was really easy for him to get frustrated and then get angry and then spiral into an anxiety attack. Now, when he wasn't doing that, he was really a gentle, kind, almost innocent kid, and a pleasure to be with. Now, as a teacher, I believe that every student creates joy in my heart. Some when they walk into the classroom, and some when they walk out. Peter was definitely in the in column. Carson was definitely in the out column. Now, Carson was a transfer sophomore, and he came to the school 3 weeks late. Now, teachers oftentimes don't have privy to what the background is on a student. So we didn't understand what the 3 weeks late was all about, and all we could get was that this was a sudden move. Well, I had Carson as a student, and it wasn't enjoyable. He was snarky. He could care less about making friends with anybody else. Academically, he did absolutely zero. And he ignored every teacher that tried to help him. Well, the weeks went on, and in a school like the Sal, it's really teamwork. And we had a situation where a phys ed teacher called in saying that his young daughter woke up with a burning fever, and he's rushed her to the hospital, and he won't be able to cover his PE classes today. So what we do then is we just look as, who has open periods, and I was free third period, so I volunteered to be the PE teacher. Now, I was a little concerned because I had no idea what the curriculum was for the day, but I was relieved to see that it was a sophomore class, so I had some of those kids as students when they were freshmen, and they really came through for me. Fortunately for me, it was fitness station day. The kids all had their little 2 or 3 person teams, and there were just things set up all over the place, and you just moved from one to the other, one to the other, one to the other, one to the other. And my job was to say, switch! And I had this stopwatch, and I watched it because it was every 7 minutes, switch! And they'd move over to the next station. What I forgot was that with PE classes, you're supposed to end them 10 minutes early so the kids can go back into the locker rooms and get dressed for their next class. Well, the bell went off, and everybody realized that I had blown it, that they were going to be really, really late. So I told them, look, here's what we're going to do. I'm going to go into the office, and I'm going to send an email out to all the teachers telling them it's my bad, so you're not going to get into trouble for being late. So they rushed into to get changed, and then out they went. Just as I hit the send button for that email, which I titled, Mike Devenney Screwed It Up Again, I heard screaming, and I knew it was Peter. So I came out of the office, and I walked through the coach's door for the locker room. And I couldn't see Peter. I could hear him, but I couldn't see him. But I could see the back of Carson. And I knew it was Carson because it was the same purple jacket that he wore every day. And I got thinking to myself, if he's giving Peter a hard time, he's going to get his wish. We're going to throw him out of school. Nobody should do that. Now, I'm a little embarrassed by this. I didn't do anything yet. I wanted to hear more so that I'd have evidence. I was that angry. But that wasn't it at all. Carson was trying to talk Peter down. He had gone from being very worried about being late for class, and he just spiraled right up to an anxiety attack. And what really cued it off was he was so upset and moving so fast, he put his pants on backwards. Been there, done that. Right? But that really set him off because now he knew he was going to be thrown out of school for being so late. But Carson just kind of talked him down a little bit, was very respectful. He gave him directions on how to take off your shoes. Now, take off the pants, turn them around. You got this. Put them back on. It was great. I was so impressed. And then Peter started to spiral again. He was going to go off. And, you know, and you could hear him screaming. And that's when Carson said this. Dude, no problem. I'm a student assistant. I can walk you to your class, take you right to your desk, and then I'll go to the teacher and tell him that it's not your fault because that jerk, Mr. Devenney, screwed the timing up. Well, that was a lie. Well, the jerk part may be okay, but he was not a student assistant. But it worked. The two of them walked out of the locker room, and I knew things were going well because Peter had this confidence walk. And he was doing that walk. So I followed them down from a distance because they hadn't seen me yet. And just before he took him into the classroom, he turned to Peter and said, "We got this." So he took him into the classroom, walked him right to his desk, helped him set up, went to the teacher, and I couldn't hear what he said to the teacher, but the teacher seemed to be okay with it. And then Carson turned to come out of the classroom into the hallway. And I was standing there, arms folded. And when he saw me, he put on his eat dirt and die look. And I said, "Young man, you are very late for class." And he stiffened up and went, "It's not my fault. It's your fault. Why will I get in trouble?" And I responded, "Dude, no problem. I'm a teacher. I can walk you to your class. I'll walk you to your desk if you like, but I'll tell the teacher that it was my bad. We got this." And Carson almost smiled. But the two of us walked down the hall, and I thanked him for helping Peter. And he looked at me and he said, "No problem, Mr. D. Peter's a great guy. He just needs a little help now and then." And that was Carson's moment. That was his catalyst. Everything changed after that. Peter and Carson became a thing. They were really good friends, and they were really popular together. And it was working out just so great. When he got into the second semester of the year, he actually applied to be a student assistant for that program that Peter was in. And I wrote his letter of recommendation. So everything got better for everybody. Peter had a better life. Carson had a better life. Carson's parents had a better life. The teachers at LaSalle had a better life. And I, the jerk of them all, had the best life ever. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. So before we jump into intermission, I have two announcements and a drawing. Do we have the cards anywhere close by? If you would be so kind, sir. First announcement, if you'd like to know more about what the Portland Storytellers Guild does, its activities, and everything we have to offer, you can find us at portlandstorytellers.org. And we'd also like to remind you about next month's live performance, which is called Telebration, which was originally set up by the National Storytelling Network. But it's an evening that celebrates the variety and just the veracity of storytelling, and it happens on a single night all over the world. So there are stories rising up everywhere. And we're hoping that you can join us on November the 9th, 7:30, right here at Artichoke. We have stuffed Telebration with as much variety and as much wonderful storytellers as is logistically sensible. All right, so we hope you can join us and hear all of that storytelling as well. Now, here in the evening, we ask people to write out a little card for us, letting us know where they heard about the Guild or what they heard about the performance. And then in exchange for those, we draw one card here at the intermission for 2 free tickets for the next live storytelling, which in this case is Telebration. So I'm wondering if I can have some help pulling a card.
I think you can do it.
You heard about us at Google. Your name is Deb. Deb, are you here? Oh, great. Okay. All right. What happens, Deb, is we'll first get your last name, and then we'll give that to the front office here, and when you show up next for Telebration, tickets will be waiting for you. All right? Thank you for helping us. So if you haven't already hit the bar, now is the time to do it for drinks, including sodas and snacks. And you know where the bathrooms are. We'll see you back in about 10 minutes. Thanks. Welcome back, everyone. So first off, I want to say, if you have been in contact with the outside world during the intermission, it's time to remute those personal electronic devices, right? We also, for those of you who are watching online, we found out that there was a glitch in the feed, so the first 20 minutes was not broadcast with audio. However, they do have a master recording, and Gary's going to go home tonight, plug the whole recording in from the master recording, and it will be up on the archives at Artichoke. So you'll actually be able to hear the whole first part of the show, all right? So now, let's begin our second half by welcoming our third storyteller this evening. Please help me in welcoming Kriya Kaping.
All right. You can hear me okay? All right. So I'm in Dr. Rhodes' office. He's my advisor at Southern Oregon University, and his office is the very epitome of an academic's. Every surface has books on it and leaning towers of manila folders that are dropping student essays like leaves falling from a tree. So we're here to talk about my future, and the ink on my degree is still metaphorically wet. But my understanding of my future really actually has me wet behind the ears. Dr. Rhodes drops a huge 3-ring binder into my lap. Plop. Kriya, you're gonna need to earn one of these very competitive international internships, that is if you want that postgraduate scholarship. Now, you have selected one, but I need your top 3 choices by the end of the day. That is if you want my reference. But the thing was, I didn't need 3 letters of recommendation. Only one would do, because it was going to be the stagiaire internship for those of us that are, speaking English. The stagiaire at the International Archives for the Women's Movement in the Netherlands, or nothing. See, now sometimes you just know a thing. Well, I knew 3 things. One is that I was going to put this degree in international relations to good use. 2, I was going to live abroad in one of the most beautiful cities in Europe. And 3, that the International Archives was going to be my new home. Rhodes gave one of his famous long sighs. Oh, Lord. Now, he was always seeming to be just a little bit exasperated with me, But then I think it was just his way. See, he was an old curmudgeon, ready to retire, and I was a 20-something-year-old, ready to go forth my new career. He was always telling me, warning me actually, about my unearned confidence. I was always telling him, you know what, I'm fated for greatness. So he finally gave me a letter, and he said, here's my letter of reference, even if you rarely take my recommendations. Now, 2 months, almost to the day, I'm at his goodbye celebration for his retirement, and this time I get to give Dr. Rhodes a letter, and it's a letter of acceptance to, guess where? The International Archives for the Women's Movement in the Netherlands. That's right, I knew it all along. And this time he sighs, oh man, but I can feel that it's tinged with pride. So there I am in Amsterdam. It's the first time I've ever been to Amsterdam. It's the first time actually I've ever been to Europe. See, I did not suffer what many of my peers suffer, this, syndrome of not being good enough, this syndrome of not thinking they could do it at all, because I knew that I'm Kriya Kaping. And there's only ever been one Kriya Kaping. There will only ever be one Kriya Kaping. I would like you to Google it. Good luck. There isn't another one. So I knew that I was exactly where I needed to be, right there in Amsterdam, right amongst the bikes and the old canals and the cattywampus leaning buildings from the 17th century. And I took my little wheelie suitcase and I bumped along all those cobblestone streets, and I made my way to the IIAV, which is the International Archive in Forum Serentum in Vor. Anyways, my Dutch never did get better by this time, but it's just abbreviated, thank goodness, to the IIV. And I could not wait to start. Start what? I didn't know, but I knew it all started there at the archives. So I roll up. There it is, right in front of me, the International Archives for the Women's Movement. And I have my little wheelie suitcase handle in one hand. I have a few hundred guilders in my fanny pack. And I have a map to the city in the other hand. Now, this is the late 90s, so there's no cell phones. There's no Siri directions. There's actually no European Union, and thus no centralized currency, so there's no euros. And I'm looking at this building, and I'm thinking to myself, holding all of the world's history of women and feminism, you would think that this place should be like the Rijksmuseum, but it's not. It's actually a very modern concrete building, and it's filled with bright lights, and it has a picture window that looks out over the street, so anyone that is strolling by can wonder what wonders reside right there in the orange and red color shelves. I felt like I was walking up to the Great Library of Alexandria. Now, you're probably wondering why you have never heard of the IIV, right? It not only holds, this archive of women feminist literature, but for all of the world. And let me tell you something. It's because women's history is often hidden. It's also often erased. It's often mansplained. And sadly, it's often forgotten. And it's really hard to find our stories, but I found them. And I walked straight up those stairs into the archive library. Now, these librarians, they are very well known for scooping up misplaced things, assessing them, finding their proper location, and they had me sitting in my desk ready for my new internship so fast it had my head spin. They were amazing. As a matter of fact, they were the most warm and competent librarians. I like to think of them as the world's most badass librarians, all right? And the most assured one of the bunch was my mentor, Lynn Pugh. Now, she wasn't Dutch. She was actually an Australian expat. She had moved to the Netherlands decades before, following true love. And so she had kind of white, spiky hair, and she had a very fast gait that I was always kind of running behind her to try to catch up. And most of all, she had a thick Australian accent that she had never been able to get rid of. And every time she was speaking Dutch, there was a little bit of "good day, mate" in it. Now, the Library of Alexandria, I'm sure you know this, was dedicated to the 9 muses. But here in the archives, there was tens and thousands of the world's most amazing, prominent feminist authors. They were my muses. And I just could not get enough reading in. My eyes just couldn't take it in enough. So sometimes I would go up and down the rows of the shelves, and I would just feel the hardbound books, and I would feel the glossy texture of the magazines and the roughness of the binders that held photos. It was almost like I was physically trying to take in all of that knowledge of luminaries like Hildegard. I was trying to reach out and touch the humble brilliance of Eleanor Roosevelt. It was like if I touched it enough, I could almost get all of that knowledge in by osmosis. So you're probably guessing right here and right now I'm a huge nerd. And you would be exactly right? It was the first time that I had ever been at a library and didn't feel like I was just a visitor, because I had Dewey Decimaled myself into the collection itself, right? And so have you ever loved a place so much you never wanted to leave? Maybe there's a special garden for you that you just don't want to leave. Or maybe when you were young, you're at the Natural History Museum, right? And there's all of these dinosaurs, and you just want them to yourself for one night. Or maybe you're a swimmer. There's some swimmers back there. And you just want the Olympic-sized swimming pool to yourself, please, just for one day. It's like Virginia Woolf, right? She just wanted a room of one's own. Well, I wanted an archive of my own. And maybe that is why Lynn and the poor librarians were having such a hard time trying to get me to go home after closing. I didn't want to leave. And so I could tell after a couple weeks, the librarians were really starting to get frustrated with me, because Lynn Pugh sat me down for a heart-to-heart. She said, "Crikey, Kriya." So I'm not going to use an Australian accent anymore, because it's painful for me, and I know it's going to be painful for you. So she said, "Bloody hell, Kriya. Why am I having such a hard time trying to get you to leave when the archive closes? I mean, you're in one of the most exciting cities in Europe. Go out, be young, experience it for yourself." And I said, "Listen, Lynn, I love Amsterdam, truly I do. It's just that I'm an American, and we are hardwired to want to overwork, overthink, overindulge, and sometimes we overeat. It's just our way. That's how I was raised." But she was having none of it. She was like, She said, "Flamin' hell, Kriya. Why don't you go out and break some rules like a good feminist? Not laws, just some rules. Why don't you go to a rave? I don't care, experiment. But what I need you to do is get out of here tonight, and I will see you tomorrow." So I tucked a little bit of my pride, my metaphorical tail between my legs, and I also tucked a book, my favorite book from the archives, under my arm. And it just so happens this is the very book, the real book. This is from the archives, so you're probably guessing by now it's on permanent loan to me. So it's just going to be our little secret, shh, no telling. And so I took it home to my flat I shared with another expat American. And lucky for me, I had the whole flat to myself that night because she was a young 20-something-year-old doing bar work under the table and making money. So what I did is I read about assertive biblical women. I pushed out my bed, which was just 2 couch cushions smushed together, and I read about Queen Jezebel and this great quote. The quote is, "Assertiveness is not an intrinsic good. It's a virtue that depends on the goal being pursued." Thank you, assertive biblical women. I hatched my plan for the next day. So anyone that knows me knows that I am not a morning person. That is not when the muses talk to me. That is not at all. I'm a night owl. And so it was a bit surprising for Lynn Pugh to see me there bright and early, first thing in the morning at 10 o'clock, right? And so I sat down and I said, you know, Lynn, I have been thinking about your great mentorship and advice all night. And you're right. I would like to know if I can leave early tonight because I would like to go out and take a sexy salsa dance lesson. Now, Lynn, her people were probably back in the day convicts, right, that were sent to this penal code on the continent. So she had a keen sense and smell for bad habits and a little bit of lying. But somehow, she believed me. I don't know why. It must have been because just like Queen Jezebel, I was giving off the vibes that I'm just basically misunderstood. So, but 5 o'clock that evening, I said, Lynn, good night. I'm leaving right on time. And I left and made sure everyone heard my goodbye, especially the front desk librarian. I said, Totsins, goodbye, leaving on time. 5 minutes later, I circled back. Came back in, I said, oh no, you know what? I just left my book. Let me run and get it real fast. But what I really did is I beelined it straight to the public restroom. And there, with my book in hand, I tucked up my legs in one of the bathroom stalls, and I read about my rule-breaking biblical women for 2 hours. And then, as soon as it was about 7 o'clock, all the lights went dim. And there was only a green haze of illumination that was letting me see my way. And so I had sat for so long with my legs tucked up under me that my legs were cramping. And I was kind of like waddling out of the restrooms like a very cautious penguin, trying to see if there was anyone left in the archives. There wasn't. I had the whole place to myself that night. Oh my gosh. I didn't know what would happen to me if the librarians caught me. But you know what? As badass librarians as they were just a bunch of sweet, soft sweethearts, right? It could be nothing as bad as what happened to poor Queen Jezebel. Oh, I know. It was awful. What happened is they had her eunuchs throw her out the window. And when the king of Israel kind of came to his senses and asked for her to have a proper burial, it was discovered that her body had been eaten by dogs. I know. I am telling you, reading about all of these assertive biblical women at night, it gives you nightmares. But lucky for me, I was not in the least bit tired. I lounged, I read, I skipped amongst the shelves. The whole place was my kingdom. I was Queen Jezebel, the alive version of her. And this world of feminist literature was all mine. First thing the next morning, I was the person in her desk right as the archive opened because I had never left. So this might have actually been, now thinking back on it many decades later, it was probably what gave me away. But by sometime by lunch, I knew the librarians knew. Now, how they knew, the truth is we will never know, but they knew. Because the director of the IV, Madame Everett, she was a person of great power. She had prestige. She was personally appointed to her position as the director by the Dutch government. And she had directed Lynn Pugh to walk me out of the archives each night at closing. So we took our little walk of shame each evening as we left. But this little walk only happened for about 1 week. That was until the letter came. This letter was a letter directed to Madame Everett. So you know it was an important letter. It was a letter from the Dutch government saying that my visa paperwork had been improperly processed and I was to return to my country of origin forthwith. It was in that moment where I felt like my whole worldview was actually crumbling in on me. Everything I had known to be true, everything that I hold true was now uncertain. Dr. Rhodes' words were coming back to me. And I didn't know what to do because if I left my internship and went back to the United States, I would be effectively losing also my scholarship. And there was no retrieval for that. And so not only would I be losing the internship and the scholarship, but I would be losing the best mentor I ever had, who was trying to mold all of this rebellious feminist energy into something truly great. I was now going to lose every person I cared about and the place I cared about the most. I was no longer Queen Jezebel. Now I was Miriam, and this was the great exodus. It was my exile. And I was listening to those words and that warning from Dr. Rhodes saying unearned confidence would be my downfall. And I had not, in all of my assuredness, I had not done the due diligence to see that my visa paperwork was properly processed. And so now I was an outcast. So I did what I had been doing all along. I went to my book and I tried to figure out if there was any advice from these assertive biblical women. And you know what I realized after reading all of this? Is that all of these women knew a miracle when they saw it. So I found out that Madame Everett had selflessly and heroically, I might add, petitioned the Dutch government on my behalf to amend the deportation order so they would not have to escort me to the plane and make me leave. Now she was someone that was like another great biblical queen. She was like Queen Esther, right, who had petitioned the Persian king to let the Israelites return to Zion and rebuild Jerusalem. So now, instead of me losing everything, all I had to do was leave the Netherlands for a while until my visa paperwork could be properly processed. So I was singing a song of joy. Let me tell you, maybe it's not the song of Miriam, where she was singing it with the Israelites when they, after they had crossed the Red Sea and Pharaoh's army had all been drowned, they were singing, but it was something, it had the same sense of hope to it. Now, if I was going to be exiled, there was just this sticky little situation where I had to leave in less than 2 weeks. Now, I needed help and I needed a companion. And so who would I call? Of course, I called my mother. And I said, hey, Mom, you remember how you were going to meet me at the end of my internship and we were going to travel around Europe together? Well, could you get to Amsterdam in about a week? Now, lucky for me, she was in between jobs and was able to come to Amsterdam pretty darn quickly. And she came with the promise that Ruth has to Naomi. She said, wherever you go, I will go. Wherever you stay, I will stay also. Your people will be my people. Your God will be my God. Okay, maybe not that last part. But we did. We were like Ruth and Naomi. We were being cast out into foreign lands. And unlike Ruth and Naomi, we did bicker a little bit more than they probably did. But it was the same thing. We took our little wheelie suitcases and we went forth. Now, Ruth and Naomi, they had to travel and roam the ancient land of Moab, and we were going through Western Europe in the fall. It was beautiful. So with great travel adventures and mother-daughter, it wasn't quite 40 days and 40 nights, but it was somewhere therein when I got the email. And it was from Madame Everett. Now, see, librarians have a special skill. It's their superpower. They are able to put clerical errors right. She had put my whole visa paperwork right, and now I was welcome with open arms to return back to the Netherlands, return to Amsterdam, and return to my internship. And here's something. When I walked into that IV, there was Lynn, and she gave me a huge hug. And she said to me a quote that was also in my biblical book. And she said, oh, yeah, well-behaved women seldom make history. Welcome back. Yes, thank you very much. There's a little epilogue that comes to this. 4 years later, I decide that I am returning to the lowlands, and I'm returning to now do my master's degree. And I am studying in Belgium, and the lowlands has always been this catalyst, this place where it transforms my life. So there I am in Belgium doing my master's studies, and I'm ready to write my thesis, and I decide I want to write it about feminist theory in international relations. And my all-male professors say, you can't do that. You know why? Because we do not have an advisor for you. There is no one that can advise you on your thesis. And Kriya, if you go alone, you are taking a risk. Because if your thesis is rejected, then all of your studies will be for naught. And I said, well, that's funny. I am not going out on my own. I know a place where there are some badass librarians that I know would be happy to advise me. So 4 years later, I roll up to the IV with my little wheelie suitcase in hand, and they open the archives to me yet again. This time, I do not spend the night, and I do not permanently borrow any books, but I write my thesis, and they advise me every step of the way. My thesis is this one, right here. It's called From the Apple to the Exile, a feminist theory of international relations and epistemological understanding thereof. And what's funny is the driving symbolism throughout this entire thesis is Eve reaching for that apple, reaching for that self-knowledge, that world knowledge, that ability to bend and break gender stereotypes, to write herself into biblical history for all time. Now, I bet that the University of Kent of Canterbury probably only has one thesis that has a naked lady on the cover. And it happens to be mine, Eve reaching for her apple. Because you know what? I have always loved assertive biblical women. And now it was my writing. It was that now in the archives. And I have to tell you, after I defended this piece of work, it had been awarded distinction by the university. And now I could wear a gold-colored sash, sort of like the Ark of the Covenant. And biblical women, they had been my heroes. And now it was my work that lives at the archive. Thank you. Thank you. And now I would like to once again invite my fellow storyteller, Stephen, to come up and finish us off. I'm going
Thanks, Kriya. I remember it as if it were yesterday. You know as well as I that events from our childhood shadow our lives, so that something that at first we can only vaguely remember, at last we must come face to face with it. And here I'm having to admit to myself, as I'm admitting to you, that I had always been intimidated by the fish where I grew up. But early on, I turned away from that self-knowledge. I would move every 2 or 3 years, telling myself rationally enough that I was looking for new opportunities, a new life, and not running from the fish. But after all, our streams were not always guided so carefully through those great concrete round culverts under our streets. Our rivers were not guided so safely down those concrete channels. Back in Oklahoma, where I grew up, there were some big flathead catfish that had to wait for a wide spot in the Red River before they could even turn around. And there was one who'd been running that river since before anybody who was alive could remember. They called him Lenore. God knows why. No, I take that back. That was probably the name of the first person who had ever hooked him, because no one had ever caught that fish. In fact, most of the time, he didn't even mess with you. He just bit off your leader, and that was that. Now, I will admit, I was a callow and cynical young man, and I had heard stories about that fish all my life, and in hearing them, I would ask myself how it was that a fish that was supposed to be as big as Lenore was supposed to be could support itself on stolen bait, right? Of course, they do say he would take livestock. If a rancher or farmer, say, would bring their livestock to graze along the river, you could do that in several places because the grass came right to the verge. But if Lenore happened to be running that part of the river right then and they weren't paying any attention, they'd come back in a while, find 2 or 3 sheep gone. Fin marks on the bank. Now, I understand your reaction, and we'd heard stories about that fish all our life until finally my Aunt Venera, everybody called her Johnny. Aunt Johnny, oddly enough, right? Aunt Johnny finally declared that the only reason that no one had ever caught that fish was that no one had ever seriously tried, and she would do it. And apparently, I was going to help her. I think she'd identified me as pliable. And I'd only just gotten my driver's license. She told me to come back in the afternoon and drive her down to one of the area scrap yards. Now, Aunt Johnny, she knew scrap yards. And we found her a big, long, rusted length of log chain. Now, I don't know if you're familiar with that, but it's about as big around as your wrist. And I knew Lenore was big, but frankly, that made me nervous. And then she had me drive her down to one of the body shops there in town, had the guys at the shop make her a good-sized steel hook out of an old piece of car frame. Now, I still did not know what her plan was, but in the trunk of my car, she had put an axe and a saw and a trussed-up burlap bag that thrashed about and occasionally emitted a plaintive bah. And then we drove down along that part of the river where Lenore was supposed to be running right then, and we found this big, stout tree right on the bank, and we stripped it. We used that axe and the saw to take off all the limbs and the bark and whatnot. And Aunt Johnny showed me how to winch that tree down like a snare so she could attach the chain to the tree, hook to the chain. And she fixed it so whenever that fish hit, it would snap up. It'd go, whoop! And that would set the hook, you understand. Now, Aunt Johnny, she was a thoughtful woman, and she didn't just jump into this willy-nilly. She had spent the preceding 2 weeks collecting first-person narratives from her friends and family about the fish, and another week sitting deep in the archives of our local newspaper, The Whisperer. And I think it was there that she realized that over the years, Lenore had developed a taste for mutton. And I stood there watching Aunt Johnny. She was sitting on the edge of the river, glancing out across the water. Now, she was taller than me at that point in time, kind of sun-darkened, skinned over knobby bones, like she'd spent way too much of her life wrestling things. And I saw her nod to herself. And she turned around and came back to the trunk of my car to that trussed-up bag that had quit thrashing about. And she untied it, and she removed a moderate-sized sheet from it, rummaged in her purse, and came up with a coil of rope. And she walked it down to the edge of the river there, and then she and I commenced to tie that sheet to that big steel hook, and we pushed it out into the river where it floated, looking concerned. And then we went home. I mean, Aunt Johnny, she didn't have the patience to listen to stories about the fish, much less wait for the fish itself to show up. And as I drove away, looking into my rearview mirror, I could see that sheep swimming hard for the far bank, and I wished it well. Now, first thing the next morning, Johnny called me to tell me that she didn't need me. Said, "Hun, you get so nervous, you're like to spook the fish. I mean, fish are intuitive. They can sense fear." And then she went and had her hair done. Well, it's Becky's shop, which is like right along the Little League ball field there. And well, see, Johnny always dressed well for any community event. Apparently, she wasn't going to let that fish stand in her way. But she did tell me later that finally, late in the afternoon, she did make it back to the river. And what she found was that big, stout tree jerked up by the roots and drug halfway into the river. And she could look out, and she couldn't see anything moving, but she wasn't sure because a mist had come up on the water. It was lapping up against the bank. And then, this is so like Aunt Johnny. Despite being in a good pair of heels and worrying about nicks in her hose, she crawled out along that tree till she could get a hold of the chain. And she gave it a jerk. And it was weighty, but no fight. And so she backed, and she pulled. And she backed, and she pulled until she got back on the bank, and Aunt Johnny, she just leaned into that log chain. And I hate to tell you this, after all of that, but she did not catch Lenore. She did, however, hook 75 pounds of his upper lip. Now, I understand your reaction. I snorted right in her face. And Aunt Johnny kind of shook her head like she was disappointed in me, but she took me home and she showed me. She had stuffed and mounted that 75 pounds of upper lip and hung it on the wall of her den. And as I stood there looking at that fish lip, I developed a considerable amount of respect for that creature because even stuffed, mounted, and hanging on the wall of Aunt Johnny's den, that 75 pounds of upper lip had a sneer on it. And I'm not embarrassed to tell you, I became a vegetarian shortly thereafter. I'm a little less, well, I'm perhaps more embarrassed to tell you that I ran. I mean, I would move every 2 or 3 years telling myself rationally enough that I was looking for a new life, right? A new opportunity, and not trying to find safety, first in smaller places and then in larger towns as I began to look for less nature, I guess. Until finally, I settled in big cities where I was certain every stream and every river was safely contained in those great round concrete culverts under our streets. But I'm an older guy now and a realist, and I have come face to face with the fact that not even concrete is eternal. And so I always look for those places where everything is contained in those great round concrete culverts, because I knew that there must be at this very moment fish pulsing under our very feet, murmuring to each other, plotting revenge, and in the spirit of the enemy of my enemy is my friend, probably conspiring with sheep. But here in the big city, I don't have to worry about livestock. But sometimes in the evening, I'll be walking down to my local coffee shop, and I will pass a manhole cover. And tangled in the steam rising out of that manhole cover, I swear I can hear the whispered word, Lenore. That's right, yeah. Thank you. I'd like to invite Kriya and Mike back up here with me, if you would. Come on up, friends, because we want to thank you for coming in tonight and listening to our stories. Mike, Kriya, there we go. Hey. So we'll hope you will come back next month for Celebration, and watch out for those catalysts in your life, because things will change. And again, thanks for joining us. You take care of yourselves.